Hey y'all, we want to welcome you back to another session of the Loft at the Table, where we recap the last sermon series that we went through at the Loft and in home groups, and we do a little bit of a deeper dive and talk about what's going on in that series. If you haven't been listening or you don't know our student ministry, my name is Lane Malikian. I am the student pastor up at the Loft.
And my name is Scarlett Elsick, and I'm the associate student pastor.
And today we'll be looking back on our playlist series, which is a 4-week series out of the Psalms, talking about emotions and how we respond to God in the midst of those emotions, and really what those mean for kind of everyday living in a way that a lot of other scripture just doesn't speak to that. And so we'll begin that conversation today. Go ahead and put in your AirPods, turn up the sound in your car, and listen in.
So in our series playlist, we have gotten to go over a few different emotions that David presents in the Psalms and talk about them and what it looks like in our own life and God's response to him. So we got to talk about joy. We got to talk about despair, abandonment, his goodness. And so we're going to dive in a couple of those today as we kickstart us off. And so first, one of our first ones, we talked about despair, which is a pretty heavy word that we experience. And looking at the Psalm of David in despair, how could we define that first in our own life of what despair is?
Yeah, because despair is it feels like this deepest of sadness emotion. It's different than just some of maybe the daily sadness or frustration that we walk through. And David is going through, he's being hunted down and all this other kind of stuff. So I think when we begin to think about despair, one, obviously nothing is discredited, in the eyes of the Lord. We can't just sit here and go, we don't want to minimize our emotions, right? And so we don't want to sit around and think, well, this isn't despair. This emotion isn't heavy enough for me to care about going to the Lord in it. And so I think that's important. Whatever we're feeling at whatever depth, the Lord can handle it, and we need to spend some time with him in that. But when we do talk about despair, I think just being aware of it coming from the word desperation. And I think we need to be aware of that because of how we are going to be prone to handle things. So it's in despair that I think we're prone to go to substances or addictions or being accepted or other relationships in unhealthy manners in order to fill a void. And so despair, I think, is void creating within us and has us longing for something more. And oftentimes that we don't know what that is or what to place into that thing. And so we grasp at straws and everything else in between.
Yeah, it's more than just, oh, I failed this test today and I'm in the depths of my despair now. Or you get in an argument with your sibling or whatever it is, or it's like, man, I watched this terrible TikTok and now I feel like I'm in the bottom of Sheol or something like that. I think despair. And I think that's a good way to put it. It's this void that you are trying to fill. And so when you're in a moment like that, where it's like things feel so empty and you do feel desperate, how does the Lord play into that? And so how can we go to God with that? And what do we need in that moment?
Yeah, it's so weird, right? Because we use these phrases in church world that are like, oh man, you just gotta take that to God. But we never talk about what does taking something to God look like? What does confession, although this isn't necessarily confession and sin, but just being vocal about our feelings, because a lot of us kind of grew up and the only time we're praying is in a circle with people after Sunday school or whatever it is. And I think a healthy habit of getting alone with God, and so being okay within our room and literally talking through our feelings and our situation, even if it's in narrative form, oh God, I'm going through this thing and this thing is happening, and we're not asking for anything. We're literally just explaining our situation before the Lord. I think that is obviously one form of taking it to the Lord. And then I think learning to do that in other outlets. And so being able to go, okay, God has also given us people in our life to be able to take that to as well. And so knowing trusted people that don't just care about us, but care about Jesus and care about us, and going, I need to confess this or talk about this or talk through this with somebody else so that they can be what we see in Galatians, a burden carrier with me. So that way something just feels lighter. And so I think those are, when I look at and I think about taking something to the Lord or to the community of faith, I think those are kind of the two ways that I look at that.
Mhm.
Is there anything that you would add to that, or anything we're missing, or a more creative way to do that? Or
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think there's something in being able to tell your story and maybe at, like, different points, like, whenever something, like, fresh happens, like, it can be difficult to share and, like, you begin to share details from that, but as you're healing from it, new things may be coming up where it's like, "Oh, I really felt this afterwards in this moment," or, "I really felt guilt," or whatever it was, like, just being able to talk about it is, like, a healing process in itself, and especially sharing it within other bodies of believers that it's like, "Oh, maybe this thing also happened with me too, and
mm,
this is, like, how I saw the Lord through it." You can find encouragement in it as well, and so, I think that's part of that healing process and being able to talk about it too.
yeah, and I think also having a discipline to like going to the Lord is not just expressing our feelings, but being able to listen from the Lord. And so
Mhm.
having regular study of finding our place in scripture, or in moments where we're healthy, writing down the promises of the Lord that are really easy to believe at that time, and to
Mhm.
go back to those moments. Um, I know that that's not as much taking our despair, but it kind of is, because we're letting the Lord speak to it in a
Mhm.
way that we may feel like he's being silent. Um, Emotionally, or in our hearts, or in our minds, and we have tangible written record in front of us to be able to look at in our own writing, like, oh no, the Lord comforted me then, or he was with me
Mhm.
then, and he was with me in these good things, and so I know that that is true in despair.
Right, and you're, like, leveling out, like, if the facts are here, you're, like, taking your feelings up to
Mhm.
the facts, because even in the Psalms, like, David says, like, "My soul feels, like, taken down to Sheol." Well,
Yeah.
like, that's not literally happening, even though that's what it may be feeling like, but it's like, "No, God, you are still good," or, like, "You're still faithful," or, "You're still these things." So you're, like, matching up your feelings with, like, "No, but this is still the facts about God, or the
Mm.
facts about my situation." Like, yes, it may feel like it's bad, but it may not actually be as bad as what I think it
Yeah.
is. And so sometimes it's like, okay, I'm leveling out what I'm actually feeling instead
Yeah.
of spreading them out even more.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that we're disregarding our feelings or dismissing them. We're actually honoring them, and supporting them with actual truth, and letting them run rampant in us, because they're not meant to control us. They're meant to be understood, and to be honored, but it doesn't mean that they have to own us and have control over us.
Mhm.
Um, in despair, we kind of transitioned out of despair and moved into another dark tone. We put lightness on the ends of the spectrum, and then we just spent 2 weeks what felt like in the abyss of a cave. Um, and we moved from despair, and then we talked about abandonment, which is abandonment can often cause despair and things like that. Um, I think coping looks a little bit differently, but how would we? I don't know if when I taught that session, and it was a I think it was a video session, or was that one live? That one was live.
Mhm.
But I don't know if we did a good job of really defining abandonment. Um, what are some ways that we would define abandonment if we look back and we go, man, how do I know that I'm working through feelings of abandonment? Because obviously there are like the natural things, and like the things to look to. Like, man, my parent walked out on me when I was a kid. That is a very easy thing to see abandonment in. But sometimes we're dealing with those issues and we don't realize that that's what we're dealing
Mhm.
with, or what's happening. So what are some situations that could be?
Yeah, and even, like, us talking about it too, like, you may pinpoint a memory where you're like, "No, I was physically abandoned by this person," where, like, their presence was absence from my life, and so abandonment is the absence of something, but it also can be emotionally. Maybe you feel it spiritually, where it's like emotionally this person was gone. Maybe they're still physically present, but now they're emotionally absent, and so you experience the weight of that in your body, where it's like, yeah, my dad, or you could say my dad is present, but I don't feel like he's emotionally with me. So I felt this abandonment from him at this age.
Mm,
And so there's times like that where it's like, oh, like when we make abandonment, like put in that way, you're like, I can probably pinpoint like a person, and maybe it wasn't intentional. Maybe you had a friend that was very close to you walk out of your life emotionally, and you just now realized, oh, like that hurt.
mm.
And it may not have been intentional on their end. Maybe they're going through something, or maybe they move schools or whatever it is. But it's like, oh, this is a time that I felt abandonment. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think like some natural transitions in teenagers' lives that we don't think about necessarily in abandonment. For athletes, when a coach moves to another district, right? And that coach hasn't left maliciously, like nothing bad happened. They just needed to do another thing for their family. In ministry world, the feeling of when a pastor leaves or a church leader leaves or something like that, again, not maliciously, but I remember in leaving my first church job, like there are still kids that are, mad at me almost 5 years later
Mhm.
for that departure and what that looks like, even though it has nothing to do with my relationship to them or my love for them or any of
Mhm.
that. Um, and so I think there are those moments. I think one of the ones even that a lot of kids deal with is when they graduate high school and go to college and their friends go to other schools, and there are a lot of like preconceived expectations of, well, we're going to keep up and we're still going to see each other. But what happens is your friend goes to another school, they've made other friends, they're in other clubs, now they text less, Snapchat less, whatever. And they haven't done it. They're not trying to abandon you. They're just living presently in the place that they're in.
Mm.
And if the other person hasn't really connected in their new location, in their new home, it can feel like the other people around them are abandoning them. And it's like, oh, well, they just care, so much more about their new school. I know that I struggle with that just like as a person connecting with people in places that I've left of, I connect with people that I'm presently with.
Mhm.
And so sometimes that can create some feelings of abandonment by people who feel left behind, even though nothing malicious happened. And I think being able to identify that is really useful and helps us understand how we might be able to cope with abandonment. Because the whole text was that, when we deal with real life abandonment, it makes us think that God has abandoned us because it's kind
Mm.
of in that emptiness that we start to blame God for that emptiness. And then we start to feel like God has left us empty and he's not
Mhm.
there. And so it's this chain reaction. What are the tangible ways that if we can begin to identify our own abandonment, that we can really start to cope with it?
Yeah, and I think there's different ways too, and I want to like address this specifically because maybe you have been abandoned by a parent or a very close family member, and that's why I encourage even healing through counseling and things like that because it can have a
Mm,
traumatic effect in your life, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And so I also don't want to like dismiss that as well because there is healing found in that. Then there's times where yeah, I when I went to college, I moved to Virginia, and all my friends stayed in Texas, and it was really hard to keep up with even my high school, like, girlfriends because we were so close, and then moving to Virginia, it was like this slow almost like a slow burn type of pull, and, that's a big thing too is how are you also getting connected to other people, and feeling that, like, void of, like, "Man, I feel like, they're going off and meeting all these friends and meeting all these cool people, and they, like, left me behind." It's like, "Okay, am I, like, focusing on the wrong things too?" Where it's like that's a part of the natural progression of life as I'm moving to a new stage and there's good things that come with that. And there's times the Lord like brings people in your life for a season and they move on, but it's now you have these empty hands
mm,
for new people. And so it's coming in with perspective of like, okay, even with friendships, moving into a new season of life where it's like, now I'm open to new things. Like it feels like abandonment, but now here's an open opportunity for something new to come into my life. And so I would say that on the friendship end, that doesn't obviously work for every scenario, like a coach or things like that. And so, or maybe even a teacher, you're really close with a teacher too, and that came out
mm.
of your way. But, and as far as like coping and walking through, it's like asking the Lord how to use that time in your life as well, instead of just sitting in it.
Yeah, I think in especially in some of like maybe the darker versions of abandonment, right? Like even like a parent passes away. It's like, well, they didn't abandon you, but it can feel that way depending even how that situation pans out and just closure and things like that. Anytime a void is created, right? And in that, I think just learning and thinking now, and even if you're someone who's like, man, maybe I've experienced some abandonment in places, and praying through what is it that I've begun to replace that thing with, and what does that
Mhm.
look like, right? Because we're always so prone to replace it, that person or that relationship with something that's unhealthy, or to even project things onto people and to invite people into our lives to really begin to help us see that and address that, right? So counseling is one way of that, even and probably the preferred way and the most important way. But then even just having community around us that knows our story and can see those things and goes, man, you're projecting this situation and this loss onto this other person. But then also being able to create healthy relationships that are in not replacing, but they
Mhm.
help support the role of that person. I know for me as a teenager and losing a parent, having great women around me was so helpful in losing my mom that they could never replace her, but it was a good support system and a healthy support system that was like, here are some of the things that maybe my mom would have done or would have been around in some situation, even just to fill
Mhm.
roles of like, I'm going to prom and there are certain things that prom graduation coming up that she would have held the role in our house that she was able to fill a
Mm.
role there. And so I think acknowledging that and feeling that and learning to be open to that and what new relationships can unfold
Mm.
and can support what was once there, I think is really helpful. Um, and then in that, usually it's from a place of health that we can better respond to the Lord, where we go, okay, I've, you know, the physical need or the emotional need or the mental need is being at least filled a little bit, and it's being understood at a healthy rate. Now I can begin to look where the Lord is at in all of these things.
Mhm.
Because sometimes it's just really hard to see when you're still unhealthy or it still feels dark or you're still struggling in that mess.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's like a big point too. Is like, what are you coping that with? Because
mhm,
abandonment, that's the loss of something, and so what are you filling that hole in your life with? And the Lord even providing people where it's like that's a healthy way of working through that abandonment and where that feeling of it. And so those are like big things to be aware of, even if like you may have felt abandoned by someone. What is taking that place?
mm,
And what are you allowing in your life to take that place? Because that will there's healthy and unhealthy ways of going with that.
yeah. You closed us up on Halloween just a few days ago, and I was not there, but I got to stream it and watch it online, and it was super awesome. And your point of God is too good not to share was really a great lead up into our next series. But it's interesting to spend 2 weeks in despair and abandonment, and then the next week be like, and God is too good not to share. And it's like, man, I don't know. After the last 2 weeks, it just feels
Yeah.
like maybe God is supremely average. I
And yeah, and notice too how despair and abandonment were lanes and mine was goodness. So if that
well,
just gives you any like personality traits
yeah,
here,
we play roles in student
I think
ministry.
even the whole black
Yeah, I'm
attire right
wearing my
now.
black shirt
I
and
mean,
you're
typically
like,
this is a more muted
yeah, but
day.
it's a lot of color. I don't know if I could wear that many
I got
colors at
purple
once.
nails. Yeah,
Yeah,
Laneson is all
I
black right now.
definitely don't
So
have
the
purple
despair and
nails.
abandonment, that was all his ballpark. I got
I was looking forward to it.
I like the
Um,
happier ones. It's exciting.
oh man, I can't do it. I can't. That's why I'm glad you're here.
That's why I struggle with smiling, talking about despair. If you've noticed that, like, I'm like, "This is bad."
Despair.
Talking about death.
Uh,
Okay.
but so if God is too good not to share, but there are clearly moments where, and not even just like apathetic things like that, but it just feels like God isn't good or we can't locate those things or whatever. How do we share Him during these other seasons? Because it's also in the sharing and even in the seasons that God tends to do the most in our life. Like if we take a step back and we're not talking about Jesus, we're not talking about things for a long time, like that has spiritual effect too, because
Mm,
it's in the sharing of our faith that we also spiritually grow. It's not just in the
mhm,
Bible study and the prayer and things like that. What does it look like to share God, maybe even not the goodness of God, but just about God
mm.
in those seasons?
And let me just say too, like with that, I think it's one of the like most bold, brave things to do when you're in a tough season to
Mhm,
talk about God because that is like the place that you don't want to be. But think about all the characters in scripture that were like, wow, like look at their faith.
mm,
Like Abraham, like having the sacrifice his son, like that's a hard thing. And like coming on the other side and saying, no, look how God has been good. Or Noah in the ark, or like Daniel in the lion's den, like all these moments where they have gone through something where you're like, no, did the Lord abandon them in that moment? Or they're in despair in that moment or going through something hard, but they still said God was good. And so we would talk about even these characters of faith, like it wasn't in moments where it was everything was easy, but actually moments that it was really hard. And
mhm,
so there is times in our life when it's like things feel very heavy and it's very, very hard to talk about the Lord in those seasons. And we were talking earlier, and like I went through one of those my senior year of college, and it was extremely difficult. Where I was like, Lord, like, have you abandoned me? Because it
mm,
feels like that right now. And one of my professors had basically said, like, will you still choose to worship God even if you never feel Him for the rest of your life? Like, feel that emotional feeling. And it's like, yes, like, that's where the facts are, where it's like, no, God is still good. And like right now, it's really hard to proclaim that. And like I have to speak that truth over myself. And so, and finding the right people to speak that truth in
Mm.
your life too was a huge thing, because there was days where it's like, no, it's hard to get out of bed. But my friends would come around me and it's like, Scarlett, like just remember who the Lord is. And that was huge. Like that brought me such long ways. And so like, even with that too, having people around you to know in the seasons to speak that goodness over you when it's hard to believe it yourself.
Yeah, and I think in that, it's not being, saying, "Well, I'm gonna worship God even when it's dark," or whatever. It's not like faking it till you make it. It's
Mhm.
being disciplined and obedient and clinging to truth even when it's dark, right? You're not faking anything. You're just continuing to do the thing that you know that you should do. And I think that that's just such an important difference, because people are like, "Well, I'm just faking it. I don't wanna fake it." And it's like, well, are you faking it, or are you being obedient, and honoring God for who He is, and holding on to confidence that brighter days are ahead, even if they're like a really long way ahead, or whatever it
Mhm.
is, or they're not as bright as you thought they would be, or whatever it is. And I think that's what's hugely important in that. But I love what you talked about, trusted friends, and people to speak into that. I think it's just important to share when stuff is hard. I think we're so prone that when something is hard or we're going through a bad time, we want to wait till God makes it right or redeems it, and then we wanna share our story,
Mhm.
as if God isn't in the midst of the darkness and some of the difficulty in that. And I think that we're just not a very good vulnerable people, and so we really have a hard time struggling with that. And honestly, if we're being honest with ourselves, maybe we don't trust our friends in our friend circles, especially in our teenage years, to really be vulnerable in that way. But it's in that vulnerability that real community takes place, and we really learn a lot about Jesus, and He's intentional about what that's supposed to look like. And so I think having trusted friends that you can talk about when things are hard, or when you feel abandoned, or when you're in
Mhm.
despair and you feel dark, um, is just so hugely important. And it really is the trusted friends. Uh, and I would say the most important is that friends that love Jesus, that will point you to Him, and not cover you with Hobby Lobby sayings and how God's got to plan you to death. But I mean, just sit there and mourn with you when you need to mourn, but also
Mhm.
communicate confident truths to you. Again, I remember being in high school and losing my mom, and my little sister's 4 years younger than me. And so much different to go through that period of time as an 18-year-old guy than a 14-year-old girl. And there are some things that are the same in that, but we were, it felt like our story and things were playing out so publicly, and everybody was very aware of, that my mom was sick, or that this thing was happening. And so, I mean, which was nice. It was good. Like, you always had people, but it also helped us always talking about our story. Like people
Mhm.
were asking, how are things going? And you always had this sharing space, and it put me in a good practice of sharing there. But the difficulty of it was, it in that sharing, it gives you an emotional bond to people that you really just want to make sure they're for you and
Mhm.
trusted. And so I remember for my little sister going through the early teenage dating years. And if you're dating as a 14, 15, 16 year old, and you're going through the death of mom, and you're trying to talk about all these things going on, it emotionally bonds you to this person in a way that you're not really meant to be bonded to them, because they can't carry that emotional weight with you
Mhm.
as a significant other in high school, because they're probably not going to be there forever. And whereas me, I did it with, my guy friends who I loved and who are still my friends to this day and were important to me, and it was a safe, trusted space. Um, and so that's kind of the difference of the emotional disaster. Don't put yourself in a place, in an emotionally vulnerable place that also isn't going to honor the Lord and is going to connect you with someone in a way that you don't necessarily need to or want to be connected with them. And so sharing your story is important, but being responsible to share it with trusted people is important too. And
Mhm.
if you're listening and you sit there and you go, well, man, I don't have any trusted people, then it's it's time to start arming yourself a little bit with some trusted people and building those relationships and finding those people in your communities, and hopefully in your home groups, and here in your church, or whatever church that you go to. And I think that we don't want to miss that either. That, like, yeah,
Mhm.
you need to share, but there is responsible sharing in trusted spaces with people that love you and love Jesus.
Yeah, and you'll be surprised. This happened to me countless times in college, but for me, sometimes it's hard to share, especially when like things are super heavy. Because I'm like, for me, it's almost like I don't want to burden people, so
Mm.
I'm just not going to say anything, which is also not healthy. But I remember like opening up to a friend. I was like, "Yeah, I'm really struggling right now with this thing," and she was like, "Me too."
Yeah.
And she had never told anybody either, and it was crazy because it was like, we're both going through something hard, and we've been, hanging out the past couple weeks, and we had never shared it with each other, and so you'll be surprised too how often, someone's also going through something similar,
Yeah.
or has gone through something and wants to be there for you, and
Yeah.
so, we got to be there for each other, and so, even as things come up, don't feel like you have to bottle them up,
Yeah.
because there's other people who may be going through the same thing.
And you also invite them in to really see the glory of God. Like people who step into those dark moments with you and those abandonment and despair moments with you, even if the story isn't redeemed yet, you've invited them into the story so that way when it is, they've seen the whole thing play out. And experiencing that story with somebody is so much more beautiful than hearing that story later on. And
Mhm.
they'll actually learn to look back and go, man, can you just see where God has brought us and what God has made of this and what God has done? And sometimes they'll even see it before you did. And so now you've gifted them and encouraged the body of Christ and other believers by inviting them into that a little bit
Mhm.
for them to see that play out. And just like we talk about Noah and the boat, and you're coming out of a flood and despair. The people who were on that boat and experienced that movement and so much, they get the story so much better than those of us reading about it later, even though we know
Yeah.
the end of it and they didn't. They
Yeah.
experienced it so much more beautifully than we did.
Yeah. That's so true.
So I think that's it for our playlist conversation. Do you have anything else to add today, Scarlett?
Man, this is one of I mean, obviously I'm biased towards our sermon series, but this was one that I was really, really excited about. And just, I love the Psalms and I use them as a framework for prayers in my own life
Mm.
and hope that they would be prayers for you too.
They're super fun. Well, we will see you guys at the Loft or at home groups. We've only got a few left this semester, but we're looking forward to seeing you guys out there. We hope you have a great rest of your week, a happy Thanksgiving, and a Merry Christmas on the way.
Okay, well, Thanksgiving first.
Listen, Christmas, Thanksgiving break,
Oh,
Christmas.
you're one of those. Listen,
I didn't used to be, but I am now.
I typically have been like a Christmas all year round type of gal, but I don't know if it's just being back in Texas, but people are so intense
Listen,
with it here.
I love the Lord and I want to celebrate the birth of baby Jesus all year round.
But it's just like a little aggressive, don't you think?
This is the voice of someone who doesn't have a family and Christmas memories and things to care about. Hey guys, we'll see you at the Loft.
My
We love
gosh.
you. We hope you're having a great week, and we out.